All right, good morning, everybody. What a blessed day to be together. So, we're going to go ahead and get started with our initial message today.
I'll be reading from the book Happy Life by the Spirit Joanna De Angelis, psychographed by Divaldo Franco. In the midst of your responsibilities, set aside some time for beauty. Get up early to witness the dawn, inebriating yourself with the strength of the light. Walk in silence through the woods and breathe the fresh air. Walk along a deserted beach and reflect on the majesty of the sea. Gaze at the stars and ask silent questions. Observe a rose in full bloom. Linger next to an innocent child. Talk with a senior citizen. Open up to the beauty in everything and adorn yourself with it.
Now I'm back in focus. All right, friends, let's go ahead and join our minds with our initial prayer. Let's find a comfortable position. Close our eyes if you feel safe to do so. And repeat the words of the prayer in your mind. Dear Mother, Father God, we are so blessed to be here today. Not only allowed to study Spiritism, but to enjoy each other's company in this blessed space. We thank you, God, for this existence, for this beautiful earth that supports our reincarnation. Tonight, today, tomorrow, we always pray. We pray for those who are suffering. We pray for those who are yet to know of your love. We pray for all of us around the world. Anywhere there is war, where there is emotional, psychological, and physical suffering. We pray for those who are in hospitals, those who are in orphanages, nursing homes, those who enjoy the shelter of a physical dwelling, but they still feel lonely. We pray that the superior spirits can travel all throughout, spreading consolation and hope for a better future. We are so blessed to know of Spiritism so that we can strengthen ourselves and feel more resilient. We pray today for our speaker, Peter. We pray that the good spirits inspire his talk, but also that they bless his work in New Jersey with the outstanding Spiritist Center where he belongs. We pray that we can learn a lot from him and that we can teach ourselves to apply what we learn into our daily lives. We pray for God's protections, for God's permission to begin our conversation today. And so be it. Friends, it's just a blessing to be here today with you. And as I mentioned, we have a great speaker who will join us today. So I'm going to bring Peter to the stage to join us. Welcome, Peter, as we're so blessed to have you here. Let me do one more technical thing.
Okay.
We can hear you well. So Peter is graciously accepted to join us today. And he's a worker at the Spiritist group Love and Light in Newark, New Jersey, where he has been an active member for over 20 years. He's a regular participant in the Tri-State Spiritist Federation, and in 2021, he joined the board of directors of the United States Spiritist Federation as the director of outreach. He has done lectures in English about Spiritism within the U.S. and has participated in several Spiritist symposiums. Peter loves to play guitar and teaches at the Spiritist group Love and Light, which has led to regular visits to a New Jersey nursing home to perform music. He has a long background in theater as a playwright, literary manager, electrician, and carpenter. Peter has published several children's books with his wife, Brazilian author Betty Rosenwald. I'm gonna butcher that one. Too many.
Rosenzweig.
Say it again.
Rosenzweig.
Oh, I would never have guessed that. That many consonants together. Through their company, Sem Fronteiras Press, with publishers in Brazil and Colombia. So, because you're not here to listen to me talk great things about Peter when we met him at the Divaldo Franco event in New York, I'm going to give Peter the stage so that he can talk to us, and we'll be seeing you shortly. Okay, Peter?
Okay. All right. Thank you, Cheyenne, and thank you, everybody, for having me here. It's a pleasure to speak to you today. Part 3 of the Spirit's book, which focuses on the divine laws that come from God. In chapter 8 of part 3 is the law of progress. And there are 2 questions in the law of progress that focus on the qualities of a nation and the qualities of a civilization that help them to last or to thrive. Question 788 asks an interesting question about nations. It's really a question that's based on the idea of the ebb and flow of evolution. Nations are collective individualities that pass through the phases of infancy, maturity, and decline just as individuals do. Does this truth, as proven by history, imply that the most advanced nations of this century will ultimately experience their decline and end, just like those of antiquity? So are nations kind of going through a natural biological process of advancing and declining? But the answer says, nations that only live a material life and whose greatness is based on force and territorial expansion are born, grow, and die, because the strength of a nation eventually becomes exhausted, like that of an individual. Nations whose selfish laws are opposed to the progress of enlightenment and charity die, because light kills darkness and charity kills selfishness. That being said, nations and individuals also have a spiritual life, and those whose laws are in harmony with God's eternal laws will continue to live and serve as a beacon for other nations. The United States is a product of the Age of Enlightenment. The Age of Enlightenment was getting away and was an alternative to divine right monarchy, which is how societies were formed for many centuries. Those kinds of societies were not democratic per se. And the emphasis here that nations whose greatness is based on force and territorial expansion. Ancient Rome could be another example. A more recent and very ominous example would be Nazi Germany, which was a nation in the 30s and 1940s that thrived on a very racist ideology and also an expansionist policy. And when nations are driven by that kind of force, which is, again, a more material pursuit, then they're going to eventually wear themselves out. That's what this was saying. And of course, in the case of nations like Nazi Germany, where there was very much a lot of territorial expansion, it was only a matter of time before it was going to be a war with other nations in major ways. And there's an emphasis here about the nature of selfish laws that are opposed to progress of enlightenment and charity, and they die because inherently they're unfair. One of the things that part 3 of the Spirit's book talks about is the difference between God's law and human law. And when human law is really out of harmony with God's law, then that human law will not last. But often human laws will eventually adjust over time so that they're more in harmony with God's laws, which means that ultimately they're more fair. Question 793 is talking about what are the signs of a fully developed nation? The answer is, this is part of the answer, you will only truly have the right to call yourselves civilized, in quotes, when you have eradicated vices from your society and when you live as brothers and sisters practicing Christian charity. Until then, you are merely enlightened nations that have only passed through the first phase of civilization. Part of this is a commentary about the difference between our intelligence as it develops versus our morality. But also, it is addressing that we go through different phases. And living as brothers and sisters is not necessarily our first instinct. Often we are driven by selfishness, driven by needs of survival and so forth, which can certainly lead to selfishness in the early stages of humanity, in humanity's development. But also, another question to ask is, what do we mean by a civilization? Here's a definition that's not part of question 793. What is a civilization? An advanced state of intellectual, cultural, and material development in human society marked by progress in the arts and sciences, the extensive use of record keeping, including writing, and appearance of complex political and social institutions. So there's an emphasis here on record keeping, anything that can be recorded, and also to have more formal structural organizations. Human beings, modern human beings, have been on the planet roughly 300,000 years. The earliest civilizations are somewhere around 6,500 BCE, more or less, which means civilizations as we know them only began within the last 10,000 years or so. Before that, we were often a nomadic tribe, and we were wanderers, hunters, gatherers, and so forth. And one of the things that happened in humanity's development that was very important and significant change was that we started moving into agriculture, which was somewhere around 12,000 years ago. That then meant that human beings began to remain in the same place for long periods of time, which then allowed a civilization to develop. So when we think about the total time of humanity versus how long we've had civilizations, the time we've had civilizations is very short, relatively speaking. If modern human beings have been on the planet roughly 300,000 years, human beings in earlier forms like Neanderthals and so forth, then we're going back about 6-7 million years ago. So our ability to develop a civilization is a relatively new phenomenon in terms of the overall history of humanity. Now, going back to question 793, it says, the most advanced nation from any two that have reached the top of the social ladder is the one with the least amount of selfishness, greed, and pride. The one whose habits are morally better, more intellectual than material, and where intelligence can develop freely. It is the one with the greatest amount of kindness, good faith, compassion, and generosity. It is where prejudices of class and birth are not rooted because they are incompatible with true love for one's neighbor. And its laws do not allow privileges and are the same for every member of its society. It is where human life, beliefs, opinions are respected, and where is the smallest number of poor and unhappy individuals. Finally, it is a nation where people who are willing to work are guaranteed the essentials for survival. There's a great deal in this question. It raises all kinds of questions. And part of what this presentation is about is to try to address some of the questions that are raised by this question alone. For instance, is the United States of America reasonably free of selfishness, greed, and pride? How much do we live a material life and focus on territorial expansion? Does the United States of America have a collective spiritual life? And if so, what is it? How much does this country practice Christian charity or any charity? Have we truly accepted equality because we know that prejudices of class and birth are not rooted because they are incompatible with true love for one's neighbor? That is a reference, of course, to when Jesus boiled down the 10 Commandments and said, first, you must love God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind, or in the Deuteronomy version of that phrase, all your might, and also emphasizing that we must love our neighbors as ourselves. So does our country, this country, the United States of America, how do we compare to some of this? Well, one of the difficulties in a presentation like this one is that to try and summarize everything one could possibly say about the United States of America with as complex and rich of a history that we've had in the roughly almost 250 years since we have been a nation, it's impossible. All I can do here really is just raise a few questions. There are other questions that could certainly be raised, and begin to maybe touch on some of them. And part of what I'm going to do is also dive in a little bit in a general sense about history, and to try to tie that into some of these questions that are raised through the questions in the Law of Progress, certainly question 793, but also 788. And I'll touch on other parts of the Law of Progress too. So this country, as I mentioned, is almost at 250 years old. That is, if you use the date of July 4, 1776 as when things began. I'll say more about that in a few moments. But if we just think back, I'll use the word number 250 just to make it convenient. What has happened? Well, all kinds of things. There have been profound changes just in that time period alone. The Industrial Revolution, to put it mildly, transformed the world. The Industrial Revolution began really in the 1760s in England with the development of machines that began to make it easier to produce different types of textiles. And the United States has played a major role in the Industrial Revolution. Eli Whitney, I believe it was in the 1840s or 1830s, invented the cotton gin. This was a very innovative invention because the cotton gin not only made it possible to produce cotton in mass quantities, but also to do mass production using interchangeable parts. That was an approach to technology that had profound implications on the Industrial Revolution. The United States, during that time period, certainly during the time of our founding fathers in the 1770s, 70s, 80s, and so forth, this country was very much an agricultural country, nation. And so to have someone like Eli Whitney come along, a spirit who had these kinds of advances, who could have these kinds of visionary inventions, largely a predominantly agricultural country, the world was at that time, and yet we had individuals whose genius began to usher us into a new age, and a change that happened rather quickly. There are many other things that happened in the United States moving forward besides the invention of the cotton gin. Railroads, which began in this country roughly in the 1820s and 30s, by the time we get to the Civil War, 1860 to 1865, there are railroads in many parts of the East Coast. Then once the Civil War ends, we go into the period of Reconstruction, and railroads and railroad lines start to develop. The railroad industry was very fiercely competitive during the 1850s, but especially into the 1860s and 70s and so forth. And what happened is, as the railroads expanded and went westward, that too opened up the West. And that had all kinds of profound implications for this country's development. Also had some very negative consequences for the Native Americans because the wars that existed, especially in the 1870s, the Plains Wars, were quite brutal. And it had all kinds of dire consequences for the roughly 300, or actually I think 500 plus tribes that used to exist in this country before the Europeans came here. Besides the railroad, there were other major innovations. Alexander Graham Bell in around 1876 patented the telephone. That had major revolutionary implications for the nature of communication. Thomas Edison in the 1880s, I believe it was, invented the electric light bulb with help from others, of course. But Thomas Edison was an exceptional genius, as was Alexander Graham Bell. And again, these are examples of spirits that came at the time where it was possible to usher in these kinds of advances. People later in the early 20th century, we had people like Henry Ford, who did not invent mass production, but he certainly adapted it to the creation of cars using some of Eli Whitney's innovations of interchangeable parts and so forth. And that had another profound change. The Industrial Revolution went into kind of a new phase as we get into the 20th century. And then there are other examples which I could get into, which I'll start to talk about in a moment. When we talk about advances in science, I'm not going to try to summarize that quickly. I'll just say a few things very fast. But during the time of Allan Kardec, the time of the codification, we were still in classical physics. And now we've gone into, with the theory of relativity and so forth, our notion of the nature of our existence has changed significantly. There have been major advances in biology, major advances, of course, in space exploration. Again, the United States played a major role in all of these types of innovations. We had the first person to land on a moon came from this country. Of course, we were in major competition with the Soviet Union in the late 1950s and into the early 60s. But those kinds of advances in science also coincided a great deal with advances in technology. Technology, an obvious one would be the invention of the computer, which ushered in a new era for all of us in terms of the way we communicate, the way we process information. It's also been said, by the way, that improvements in technology have positive effects on democracy. And this makes sense because as information flows and is exchanged more easily, then we're able to be influenced by one another. There's a term in biology, I believe first coined by Richard Dawkins, but I believe he backed off from this a little bit, called memes. And memes is kind of an evolutional development in which ideas are spread among people because we influence one another a great deal. That's a very simplified explanation of that. But improvements in technology, of course, have gone even further to really transform our society into what it is today. What about other areas? Social changes, the rights of women, people of color, and sexual orientation. Some of the earliest publications that would be feminist philosophy started appearing in England in the 1790s. But in this country, I believe it was in the year 1848, there was the Women's Conference in Seneca Falls, New York, which was a sizable conference that really began to help launch the women's suffrage movement. And then there are major historic figures like Susan B. Anthony, who tried to vote and would get arrested for doing so. And she and many other women were major pioneers in the women's suffrage movement. And then finally in 1920, it was, I believe, the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution that gave women the right to vote. 1920. So that's just slightly over a century ago that women had the right to vote. And before then, it was quite a struggle to even get that. I'll say a little bit more about our founding fathers in a moment, but famously, Abigail Adams, who was the wife of John Adams, one of our founding fathers, as they were putting together the Constitution in the late 1780s, Abigail Adams said to her husband, "Don't forget the ladies." Well, they did not give women equal rights at that time, but that certainly was an impulse and a thread that was reverberating bit by bit and finally led to women achieving more equality. And of course, there was a lot more work to be done after women got the right to vote to this day. And of course, it's still an ongoing work in progress. What about people of color? Well, this country has a very dark, dark past with slavery, which existed for over about 350 years. And the American Civil War, 1860 to 1865, the time of Abraham Lincoln, some people think that was about slavery, but it had more to do with just keeping the Union together because this country was deeply divided. Really, the northern states of this country were one culture, and the southern states in this country were another culture. And there was a lot of clash and conflicts. We see some echoes and reverberations of those kinds of conflicts going on right now between red states and blue states and all that. But slavery ended in 1865 with the end of the American Civil War. Some like to call it the war between the states, but it's often referred to as the Civil War because the South was trying to succeed from the North and wanted to be a separate country. Even though slavery ended and African Americans were now free, that does not mean by any stretch of the imagination that racism and persecution suddenly ended. It didn't. When we talk about the civil rights movement, there were certainly some acts of rebellion during the time of slavery that are well known. And then afterwards, there was a great deal of persecution. Some African Americans were able to flourish, some communities flourished, but then there was things like the Ku Klux Klan, which is a major homegrown terrorist group that was very powerful and rather popular as late as the 1920s. But there was lynchings and other kinds of persecutions all the time. And yet what happened is things started to change in this country later on in the 20th century, in the 1940s and going into the 1950s with the emergence of the civil rights movement. And of course, famous and very innovative leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. King, as a minister, was certainly on a spiritual mission. And he could be an example of someone like Gandhi, who came here with a specific purpose to try to help advance humanity through the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was largely born in the churches in the South. That's where a lot of it began. So it's an example of where religious organizations were getting involved in social change, which they often do. The major landmark decisions that had profound changes on this country was first the Civil Rights Act of 1964, followed, and that put an end, legally speaking, put an end to discrimination, labor discrimination based upon one's religious race or sex. And then in 1965, a year later, both of these happened under President Lyndon Johnson, we had the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which basically guaranteed everybody the right to vote. Those two acts of legislation alone are among the most profound changes in a very short period of time, not even 60 years ago. I'll confess that I lived through that period. I was a kid back then. So yes, I just told you my age a little bit, But the point I'm making is that these changes are extremely recent. And of course, there's a lot of reverberations of this, both positive as well as pushback against some of these changes going on right now. But if you think about all the accomplishments that women and people of color have made since that time period, and of course are continuing to make, have we arrived? Absolutely not. There's still a lot more to go. There's still discrimination at times. There's certainly racism. There's still the glass ceiling at times and things like that. But things are a lot different today than they used to be. It was not too long ago that some of these advances were really unheard of. I mentioned sexual orientation because that's another force of social change that's happening, and we're still very much in the middle of that one. But the Stonewall riots, which happened in Greenwich Village, New York City in 1969, was a major historic event that really called more attention to the struggles that people go through based upon their sexual orientation. And then in the 70s, it was starting to become more out in the open. In the 80s, with the AIDS epidemic, there was even more attention called to the struggles that people go through based on their sexual orientation. And then the modern term LGBTQ movement, which really happened in the 80s and is used to this day. Again, there's different attitudes about what that means and what should be included or not included, but these kinds of people's sexual orientation is more out in the open now than it used to be. People are more willing to be open about their sexual orientation now than they used to be. Of course, there's a lot of struggle over this subject as well. What about our relationship to war and peace in this country? Well, this country, again, has been very at the forefront of many technological advances. And a very ominous one was the invention of the atomic bomb, which we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 during World War II, when this country was at war with Imperial Japan. Imperial Japan, by the way, was an example of a nation that was absolutely not a force of democracy. And when they invaded other countries, they could be quite brutal. And the argument for dropping the bomb was to avoid a ground invasion of Japan. So regardless of one's feelings about that historic event, that was part of the intention of inventing it. It also, of course, ushered in a whole new age, the nuclear age. And this changed things in a lot of ways, but the obvious example is that it made all of us think twice about the kind of warfare we can engage in. And I'm not advocating war by any means when saying that, but I have a stepfather of mine I had a stepfather who was a retired full colonel in the Air Force. And I remember him saying to me that in World War I, which was like 1914 to 1918, in World War I, the reason so many people got killed in World War I was because they were fighting a 19th century style war with early 20th century weapons. So warfare had to change. But as we've developed massive modes of destruction, so to speak, it has also forced us in many ways to really push for peace. Generally speaking, the world today is relatively more peaceful in spite of recent conflicts, which are very severe. But in spite of that, in many ways, the world is more peaceful now than it was. Europe used to have wars all the time before the 20th century. It was very common. And that type of behavior is now more shocking these days. And generally speaking, there's much more resistance to that sort of thing. Are we a completely peaceful planet? Absolutely not. But this country, which again Well, another thing I could say about it is that this country transformed enormously as a result of World War II. We were unprepared when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, Imperial Japan, in December of 1941. But this country had the infrastructure and the technology in place to very quickly mobilize for the war effort. And that in turn transformed this nation. It made it more modern in many ways. Places like the West Coast were largely agricultural before World War II, but after World War II, the West Coast, California, Oregon, Washington, really industrialized. And often advances made in technology in the military and in our NASA and so forth get used for civilian purposes, peaceful purposes. So this country, again, has been very involved in creating many of these technologies that then would have profound implications, not only for the way we live our lives, but also for the way in which it has major social impacts on us as well. By the way, something I didn't mention before about technology. One of the things that happened in this country starting in the late 19th century, going into the 20th century, was the ability to produce more goods at a cheaper price, which then meant that more and more people were able to enjoy a better standard of living. Very quick example. If you think about Queen Elizabeth I in England 500 years ago, Queen Elizabeth had maybe 6 outfits. How many women today have a lot more than 6 outfits? But Queen Elizabeth in her day, 500 years ago, the time of Shakespeare, was an enormously powerful woman and was in the upper echelons of society. But it's probably safe, well, it is safe to say that people today, even at a lower economic level, enjoy a standard of living that is far more comfortable than what our ancestors lived hundreds of years ago. What about more tolerance of religious backgrounds? This country has a very diverse religious makeup, to put it mildly. We're not just a Christian nation. We may have began with a very strong presence of the Protestant church, but it really wasn't long before pretty much every major religion on the planet would be represented here. And we are more tolerant now than we used to be. It doesn't mean there aren't prejudices and religious bigotry that goes on now. It does. But just one example, when John F. Kennedy was elected president in 1960, he was the first Catholic president. That was a big deal in 1960 for this country, predominantly Protestant country, to allow and accept a Catholic president. And Kennedy was smart enough that he actually used that, and he was quite prepared to address all that. More recently, religions from the East got introduced, especially in the 1960s. People like Alan Watts, who was a popular writer about Zen and so forth. He originally came from England, but he and many, many others began to play a role in introducing more different kinds of religions. There's a sizable Muslim population in this country, a lot of sizable Jewish population in this country, sizable Zen, Buddhism, Hinduism, every religion you could think of. All the branches of Christianity, of which there are thousands, are represented here as well. What about more intellectual freedom? Yes, put simply, there is more intellectual freedom today. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in a moment, but part of the premise of this country was to encourage intellectual freedom. But before I get into some of that, I also want to spend a few minutes just talking about some of the challenges and the problems that we have. These profound changes certainly had their difficulties and their conflicts and their dark side, so to speak, but they also have had many changes that have been either promising or outright positive. but there are challenges. And a big one is growing inequality of rich and poor. This has often been the case, certainly as the Industrial Revolution happened in the 19th century. There was a big gap between the haves and the have-nots. And today, we certainly see signs of this. The antitrust laws in this country got weakened in about 1980 when the Reagan administration began. And regardless of both the pros and cons for doing that sort of thing, one of the consequences is that it's been more possible for wealth to concentrate. This causes a lot of, if it gets extreme, then it can cause a lot of civil unrest and social strife. For instance, many lose faith in our institutions to address economic and social problems. In some ways, some of the difficulties when we talk about red states versus blue states, Democrats versus Republicans and all that, some of the complaints that both political sides have are similar, but they attribute different causes to them as to why they're going on. There's that. But also, both liberals and conservatives often don't trust the government for different reasons. But there is a general feeling these days that maybe our institutions are just out of touch, entrenched, unable to adapt and to change. And there are more extreme cases of those who just don't really have respect for one another, and they don't really respect the rule of law. It's not only a lack of respect, but in some ways a lack of trust, but it's also, as Joanna de Angelis might say, psychological immaturity, because this kind of attitude can be very childish. And when we don't have respect for one another, when we wallow in our points of view and those who don't agree with us are not only wrong, but maybe don't even have the right to exist. This is a very primitive, childish, dualistic kind of thinking. And it also is a social current that can cause a great deal of unrest, and it's very destabilizing, to put it mildly. Needless to say, we're facing very serious environmental issues. Our society has transformed enormously, as I've been saying, over the last 250 years. And we're now facing major environmental changes. Global warming is obviously one that is on many people's minds right now. In this country, the United States has played a sizable role in helping to create global warming. We're also a country that has developed ways to try to address this problem, but we do struggle with having the political will. And so sometimes when people get discouraged about modern times, it's that feeling that maybe the powers that be are a little too entrenched and refuse to make the necessary changes. Environmental issues like global warming, we will see what happens, but it's one of those major reactions to the actions that we've been engaging in. And of course, we do have some who deny that there even is global warming. So we have those kinds of conflicts as well. And yet, and I'm not trying to make a political statement here one way or the other, I'm just trying to introduce the situation, but it is a fact that most of the world scientists are in agreement that this is a real issue, and it's something that we can't pretend is not there. So when we look at these kinds of issues, sometimes we think, well, can we trust our institutions? Are people too entrenched? Do we have the powers that be that have got a grip on everything else? Is this country really that selfish and ultimately more materialistic? The kinds of impulses that in question 793 would suggest that if we are like that and nothing except that attitude, then maybe our future is going to be bleak and shorter rather than longer. But let's take a little time to look at the origins of this country to put some of these in context. 1776, July 4th, is when we declared our independence. That's actually not, you could say the country began with the Declaration of Independence, and we're almost at the 250th anniversary. But the thing is, we then fought a seven-year war with Britain. It is a miracle in many ways that we won. I won't get into this, but I happen to live in Fort Lee, New Jersey, where part of the War of Independence occurred. And what happened in that area could have been the end. We almost would have lost the war completely at the end of 1776. England was far more equipped and much better trained militarily and so forth. It took a great deal of resilience. Again, I don't have time to get into the details of this, but it took a great deal of resilience and foresight to be able to fight that war and to actually win it. But even once we won in 1783, then what? This country won its independence, and it was a mess. There was really no way, this wasn't a functioning country. There were a lot of issues that were not set up. There was really no government to speak of. And the future was by no means certain. If we look at the formation of the Constitution of the United States, which started to happen in 1787, but then was done by 1789, the Constitution of the United States essentially put the infrastructure of our government together. It is, our founding fathers met in Philadelphia, and they spent 2 years trying to come up with a constitution. It is nothing short of a miracle that this happened. Our founding fathers didn't agree with each other about a lot of things. The smaller states didn't trust the bigger states. That's why they wanted equal representation, which was put into the Constitution. Our founding fathers didn't trust each other. Some were pro-slavery, some were anti-slavery. There was all kinds of differences of opinion. And yet, by the will of God, if you like to put it that way, we managed to get a constitution. Again, nothing short of a miracle, but it also is a very telling and phenomenal moment in history that these individuals, these spirits, were able to come together, and despite their differences, were able to usher in changes that were profound. Profound for a lot of reasons. There's a book I really like, which I certainly recommend, called The American Soul by Jacob Needleman, who's a historian. And he points out what this country and what is the premise of this country and how is it organized? What are the real ideals of this country? He said, to be an American was an idea, not an escapable organic given. America is a nation formed by the philosophical ideas that have been thought through by human beings. It is the only nation in the world that is so constituted. Important point. America is not a tribal, ethnic, or racial identity. It is a philosophical identity. Again, important point. Composed of ideas of freedom, liberty, independent thought, independent conscience, self-reliance, hard work, justice. This is both the weakness and the strength of America. To love America is not to love one's roots. It is to love the flower that is not yet blossomed, the fruit as yet unripened. Jesus talks about humans, or our spirit, as being like a seed. And the seed has the potential to become something greater. So the seed, when it receives the right nourishment, could become that beautiful sequoia tree in the future. And what he's saying here is, as he goes on to say, to love America is to love the future. And perhaps it is this that sets the love America apart from what men and women of other nations feel about their native land. So we're always a work in progress. That's an important way to really think about what this country is. So if we say, look, things are pretty messed up right now, yes, in some ways they are. There are things that work well, and there are things that really don't work well. But are we done? Is this it? Is this all we can expect? Absolutely not. That's not what drives this country to exist in the first place. In other words, genuine liberty is not merely an external pursuit of via material success. I know sometimes I've heard Spiritists say this. How is Spiritism going to spread in this country? We're too materialistic, too skeptical, etc., etc. Well, yes, that's part of it. But when we think about the American dream, yes, it's about material success, economic success, rags to riches type stories for those who are able to accomplish that, but that's not what everybody can do. And it might have been easier in some ways in the past when there was still a lot of development happening. But of course, economies are always changing anyways. But even so, regardless of what you think about material success, and by the way, material success is not bad. I'll say more about this in a moment, but Spiritism doesn't tell us materialism per se is bad if we think of it as a tool. If we think of it as just something to worship unto itself, then we get into trouble. But here's the point. Personal liberty is also an inward journey towards spiritual enlightenment. This is what the American dream is also about, and in many ways more about. James Truslow Adams wrote a book called The Epic of America in the 1930s, and he was really emphasizing this point. When we think about the American dream, it's not just, rags to riches type stories. It is about inner fulfillment, inward journey. And that is something that was on the minds of our founding fathers. There was a famous rivalry between Jefferson and Hamilton about the Bill of Rights. Jefferson and Hamilton clashed a lot in general. And once we had the Constitution in place, 1789, Thomas Jefferson felt we also needed a Bill of Rights. Thomas Hamilton didn't see the point. Hamilton's attitude was, look, we already have the Constitution. There's plenty of protection. Why do we need a Bill of Rights? Well, Jacob Needleman shares a few points about this. The main point is that the idea of the rights of man, which emerged so powerfully from the Enlightenment and through the mind of Jefferson, among others, is not simply and solely a negative concept. Human rights, for Jefferson, does not mean solely the right not to be interfered with by government. This is only part of it. And of course, this is the part that commands so much attention in the present world. Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton both agreed we don't want a tyrannical government. We don't want the government breathing down our necks. We don't want the government telling us what to do. But also, Thomas Jefferson was trying to reach for something more. The other part is perhaps even more important. Human rights, this is for Jefferson, means the right to pursue one's authentic obligations as a God-created and potentially God-like human being through the latent power of divine reason or conscience within oneself. Are there connections between this and Spiritism? Absolutely. Because Thomas Jefferson was saying that we need to have a Bill of Rights guaranteeing intellectual freedom, religious freedom, governments not trying to suppress free speech, the rights of the press, the rights of journalists to tell the truth, etc. We need all this so that people can realize their deepest and fullest potential. That's one of the reasons why the women's rights movement was possible, the women's suffrage movement, women's liberation, while the civil rights movement were all possible. These are all segments of humanity who were insisting on equality for everyone, which again was implied in the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence, by the way, 1776, part of what it says, and Thomas Jefferson was one of the major architects of the Declaration of Independence, he's emphasizing that the idea that all people, he said all men, but really all people are created equal. These are natural rights. They're inherently natural. Of course, we all have the right for equality. Now, that didn't happen in practice, of course, but that was the intent. And the other thing I didn't mention before, by the way, is that our founding fathers, when they created the Constitution, they knew it was not a finished document. It was a work in progress. There would be several amendments added to the Constitution as time went on, because our founding fathers simply couldn't get everything done that some of them wanted. When Abigail Adams said to her husband, John Adams, don't forget the ladies, okay, the women weren't given equal right to vote, but what happened was there were provisions in the government that allowed the possibility for changes to occur once the political will was there, the creation of the House and the Senate and everything else within it. Now, going back to this conflict between Jefferson and Hamilton, Hamilton was more concerned about the external forces of government, and that was part of his genius and his strength, because the external structure of our government allows a lot of possibilities to happen. But Jefferson wanted to make sure also that our government was set up in such a way, and the country was set up in such a way, that all of us had the right to flourish internally based upon our capabilities. He goes on to say the founding of America thus reads out as an attempt to create a form of government within which human society can function as a morally and spiritually educative force. Again, this country is based on a philosophical ideal, and the philosophical ideal is that we should be allowed to develop morally and education, the balance between intelligence and morality. So even if things are not just now, there is the possibility in the future to make things more just. So let's go back to some of the questions raised in 793. Is this country reasonably free of selfishness, greed, and pride? Well, depends on who you talk to, of course. Is there selfishness, greed, and pride in this country? Absolutely. There are people who are definitely selfish, certainly greedy to the extent that people here can be very materialistic. Can we be prideful? Oh, yes. Americans can be notoriously self-righteous. That's just one example of pride. But anytime we celebrate behavior in public in which people don't have humility, then we've got pride running amok. But is everybody like that here? Well, look, this is a very complex and very diverse nation with many people from a variety of backgrounds. So there's all kinds here. And we are a planet of expiations and trials. And so it's to be expected that we're going to have some who are like this and others who are not. But it's safe to say that this country is not 100% dominated by these types of negative forces. And by the way, I'm guessing you all know this, but I'll repeat it. The law of progress, question 785, I believe it is, asks, what are the biggest obstacles to progress? And the answer is selfishness and pride. So when we think about our need to improve from within, our inner renewal, overcoming those qualities that we all have is major to our spiritual progress. How much do we live a material life and focus on territorial expansion? Well, a few things. As far as the material aspect, I already made comments about the real meaning of the American dream. But another thing I wanted to elaborate on a bit more is in the Gospel According to Spiritism, chapter 16, which is about money, should not worship God and mammon, or you cannot worship money or God, and you cannot worship God and mammon. Mammon meaning the representation of greed. One of the points that Spiritism makes in that chapter, among others, is money is not bad. Money is neither bad nor good. It is neutral. Money is energy. And our relationship to money is very complex. But there are a lot of positive things to learn from the making of money. I won't go over the parable of the talents, but that's an example of what happens when you can multiply money in positive ways versus burying the talent in the ground and doing nothing with it. We're entrusted with these abilities here in the material world. What do we do with them? This country is also founded on that. So yes, there's the American dream of material success, but there's also all of the lessons we learn as we try to be more self-reliant, try to fulfill our deeper potentials, which can happen economically. It's when we become greedy and only worry about money or only think that's going to make us happy that we get into trouble. And again, it's a mix. Obviously, some do have that attitude, but I think there are many in this country that don't. As far as territorial expansion, again, that's another big, big subject. Certainly, this country was expanding all through the 18th and 19th centuries, less so in the 20th centuries because we pretty much had the 48 states in place. But during the 19th century, there was a lot of self-serving, rather tyrannical and racist attitudes like manifest destiny, which it was our manifest destiny to move westward and conquer the territories that were controlled by Native Americans and so forth. More recently, especially since we became a superpower after World War II, this country has both positively helped other nations. We helped Japan after bombing them. We did help Germany and other nations rebuild after World War II, but we've also massively interfered in the internal affairs of other countries, sometimes clandestinely, sometimes openly. But we've also helped nations. So we're kind of a mix of both. But when America's positive, it tries to be a positive inspiration for democracy around the world, and sometimes it is. But then there are other times when this country can be very hypocritical. And that's part of that is the struggle we go through of being a superpower in the first place, in which often we have to contradict our values. There's what we say we believe in, and then there's what we actually do. And it's a mix. It's not like we're always tyrannical, or it's not like we're always benevolent and good either. So it's a difficult question, but I would say we're still moving through this effort to become more humane overall. Does America have a collective spiritual life? If so, what is it? Again, a difficult question to answer. We're a very religiously diverse nation, so it's not about following one religion over another. But when we talk about a spiritual life, I think that example is mentioned before about the idea that part of the American dream is inward development, spiritual. That includes certainly spiritual progress. When we have intellectual freedom, it means we can all pretty much study whatever we want. If we're interested in theology, we can study that. If we're interested in inner transformation, we can study all the different areas that help us to do that. And it's something that many people here do. Many people in this country are very spiritual, whether they were born here, whether they immigrated here. But I would say to call America a nation dominated by atheism or no beliefs whatsoever, I don't think is really true. In many ways, and this is a positive quality. It sometimes is a negative quality too, because sometimes people use religion in negative ways to be very judgmental and tyrannical and so forth. How much does this country practice Christian charity or any charity? Well, we're not just a Christian nation. Historically, we've been largely a Christian nation, but there's a variety. But really the point here is when we talk about Christian charity, these are universal qualities. If you look at Paul of Tarsus in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, he describes the attributes of charity. Charity is patient, charity is kind, charity endures all things, hopes all things, bears all things. Charity does not essentially judge others. We don't rejoice at wrongdoing. These are all universal qualities that one can have regardless of what one's religious focus is. Do we engage in charity? Of course we do. Americans can be enormously generous, both financially, yes. There are many organizations that Americans contribute and support. Often when there's a need to mobilize aid for a country in need, that happens. But also many people here do volunteer for organizations, and many people donate their time and engage in moral charity, which is more important than material charity. Have we truly accepted equality because we know that, quote, prejudices of class and birth are not rooted because they are incompatible with true love of one's neighbor? I think the short answer is we've made progress. We're getting there. There's still a lot more to go. I've already gone over some of this in terms of the history of rights of women, the civil rights movement, and so forth. So it's not by all means a perfect situation by any stretch of the imagination, but just think about all the things that have changed, the things that are more acceptable and possible now in terms of who's in positions of power than what we had even just a few decades ago. I'm going to start to wrap up here with going back to question 793, which again, when we talk about the signs of a developed civilization, there's an important concept here. You recognize it by its moral development. You think you are advanced because you have made great discoveries and brilliant inventions and because you are better sheltered and clothed than savages. Isn't this a fascinating answer? Because this, again, came out in the Spirit's book, which was first published in 1857 and developed again in 1858 with the second edition. And this was in the time when this country was already making a lot of great discoveries and brilliant inventions, but look at everything that happened after that time period. It's just huge. And yet the point is well taken. That kind of intellectual progress is important. It's useful, it's good, but it's not the only thing by any means. Moral development is key. Civilization has its degrees like everything else. A civilization in transition is an incomplete civilization. It produces distinct evils unknown in the primitive state. Still, it constitutes a natural and necessary progress that remedies the problems it causes. As civilization is perfected, it ends some of the problems it causes, and these troubles vanish completely with moral progress. So as we invent all kinds of new ways of living, of course, that creates all kinds of consequences that were not necessarily foreseen, and there are numerous examples one could come up with. But if we keep working towards our moral progress, we will then understand that the moral consequences of the things that we develop and invent are important to somehow find solutions to as best we can. And of course, this can be very difficult, arduous, painful, frustrating, etc. But as we develop our morality, we also learn that we need to have the patience and the persistence and the vision to keep going. Question 800. Should we be concerned if Spiritism fails to triumph over the negligence of human beings and their attachments to material things? Well, again, it can be very frustrating. You look at today's world, everybody's so materialistic, nobody wants to change, etc. But we always have to have the big picture in mind. Ideas change gradually, depending on the individual, and several generations are needed for the complete eradication of old habits. Therefore, the transformation of humankind can be carried out only over the course of time, slowly and step by step. With each new generation, part of the veil evaporates and Spiritism will dissolve it entirely. In the meantime, even if it only cures human beings of a single fault, this is a step forward. This would be a tremendous accomplishment because this first step would make the rest much easier. This is a very encouraging commentary, by the way. It's also showing us, yes, progress can be slow. Again, you think about some of the historic changes I mentioned, the social changes. It took a while for people to finally accept them. It doesn't happen overnight. Sometimes things happen and we get a big shove, a big boost, and changes happen a little faster. But then there may be the fallout from that. There's some pushback, there's back and forth. A lot of times progress is like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and so forth. And again, it's encouraging. It's an answer to when people get frustrated and think things are never going to change, and you know, it's just not happening fast enough. But we always have to have faith that in the future things will get better, because human beings will strive to be better. Question 779, and again, I'm wrapping up here. Will progress ultimately unite all the people of the earth into a single nation? The short answer is no. And the reason for that is interesting. The progress of each nation accomplishes provides the key to the progress of humankind as a whole. It shows that when every nation on the earth has reached the same level of moral advancement, our planet will be a haven of good spirits who will live in fraternal union. In other words, what's being implied there is when we improve the environment of this place, we create more just societies. The United States has the architecture to become a fairly just society in many ways. In reality and in execution, that's not always the case. But it's got a lot of qualities to it that make that possible. And when that happens, then spirits will be attracted to come here. This gets into the whole subject of the regeneration of the planet. When we improve the environment down here, better quality spirits will come, and those who are so rebellious that they don't want to give up violence, don't want to give up racism, they're too attached to material, they will go somewhere else until later on when they finally begin to change. It's part of God's laws at work. I want to wrap up with going back to Jacob Needleman, who tells us an interesting little story about Thomas Jefferson. And again, the purpose of this is it's always essential that when we have differences of opinion, which are inevitable, we also need to respect one another. If you go into Monticello, which is the house, the mansion that Thomas Jefferson lived in, it's a historic place, you can go there today. You will see a statue of Jefferson on one side, and then when you walk in, you see a statue of Alexander Hamilton, and the statues are facing each other. Well, Jacob Needleman mentions that when he saw this, he thought, oh yeah, you know, the curators must have put this in to make a point, a kind of a statement. Isn't that nice? Turns out that Thomas Jefferson himself was the one that made sure there was a statue of Hamilton facing his statue in their house. And a friend of Jefferson came over one day to visit and saw this and thought this was weird because the rivalry between Jefferson and Hamilton was well known. But Jefferson said something revealing. He said, opposed in death as in life. Thomas Jefferson didn't want to forget Alexander Hamilton. And by this point, Alexander Hamilton had been killed in a duel with Aaron Burr. I think it was 1806, thereabouts. Here in New Jersey, by the way. And what happened was that Jefferson wanted that reminder of this man, this Alexander Hamilton, who he fought with all the time. Because I think it's telling that even though they disagreed profoundly, they still had a connection to each other that was important, and some of that is based on respect. And I'm going to wrap up with a very quick modern example of that. The United States Supreme Court. As you probably know, Justice Ruth Ginsburg passed away about 3 years ago. She was a well-known liberal judge, very influential. There was also Anton Scalia, who passed away in 2016, a very well-known conservative judge. Very, very influential in a lot of judicial decisions over the last 40 plus years. Anton Scalia and Justice Ruth Ginsburg could not have disagreed with each other more when it came to judicial philosophy. Yet, they were friends. Their families were close to each other. They used to socialize together. They used to go souvenir hunting with each other and so forth. And yet they disagreed a lot. You can just imagine the kinds of discussions they must have had as friends. And when they and yet they disagreed with each other judiciously. But this is what it's all about. We're not expected to all have the same opinion. That's not what we need. What we need is respect. And the more we respect one another, the more we can begin to understand that maybe somebody whose views I don't agree with, there are reasons for why they think them that I should take into consideration. So that part of what can happen is that as time moves on, we begin to integrate the positive qualities of different points of view, but at least we're allowed to have the different points of view to begin with. And that, when we think about the law of progress in this country, that is certainly a major legacy, but it only happens with moral development. Do we have to have moral development? Absolutely. We cannot escape it. It is absolutely the key to a more prosperous future. Thank you very much for your time.
There you go. Thank you so much, Peter, for this overview of our physical, intellectual, moral progress in the U.S. So we have a couple of questions that we want, if you have time, to answer.
Sure.
Eric is going to come up and read them for us, okay?
Okay.
Let's see. I'm Martha here.
Thank you for that talk, Peter.
Thank you.
First question is, considering the red state versus blue state conflict we are experiencing today, is that conflict part of our moral development, or is it a slowdown in the progress?
Well, it can be both. It's not a new conflict, by the way. This kind of division was there from the beginning in many ways. But I think the way to look at it is sometimes our negativity has to really get flushed out into the open before we can begin to try and understand the deeper impulses behind this and what some of the frustrations are. As I mentioned, some of the complaints that both sides of the political aisle have are similar deep down, but they have different ways of interpreting them. Where we will get into trouble is if people just absolutely positively refuse to ever budge, which means that we may have to go through this for a while. It may get worse before it gets better. Or it may also mean that it will take more than one generation to kind of work its way through. I doubt we're going to stay this way forever, though. I think it's important to always be optimistic about humanity, even if in the short run things can be very rocky and very turbulent. And there are reasons to be worried, but there are also there's always reasons to be optimistic too.
What other countries, can you think of any other countries that clearly set a better example than the USA for supporting moral development in the long run?
Well, there's no such thing as a perfect country. Some of the countries in Europe, in terms of their development for basic necessities like healthcare, you could maybe argue that there's more of a better example of morality there. Often when people complain about healthcare in this country, they will point to places in Europe that have a healthcare system that's more affordable for people and perhaps a little more humane. By humane, I mean it's not more at the mercy of the market system. Capitalism can be a great force in terms of creating innovations and motivating people to do positive things, but capitalism can also be very cruel too. So it's a mixed bag, so to speak. Brazil is a country, I think, that has a good example of certain flexibilities, especially, I think, in the area of religion and perhaps more tolerance. But you're seeing signs of that too here. It's been said that the younger generations are much more accepting of one another racially and sexually, and sexual orientation and things like that than, say, older generations have been. So I think that it's hard to, I must say, I haven't studied deeply all of the other countries on the planet to give a real definitive answer about which ones are shining examples, because there's different qualities to some of these countries. Yeah, okay.
The people that immigrate to the USA, that have adopted USA as their home, do they have any type of unique role or responsibility or contribution to the moral development of all?
Absolutely. The positive reason to immigrate here is that people are looking for a better life. They understand that they're working to establish a life today that will benefit generations in the future, their family generations. That's often what positive immigration is about. And this country's got a very long history of massive amounts of immigration. We are a nation of immigrants in many ways. The negative aspect of immigration would be people who just come here, perhaps illegally, but are more interested in just not really contributing too much to the country, but expecting something in return, kind of sucking out the energy of this place without really trying to contribute to the overall moral development. But there are lots of ways of looking at this. But if we think about Spiritism, for instance, which is, came largely from the Brazilian immigrants that have been coming here, especially since the 1980s. That's when the more modern Spiritist movement evolved. Earlier, there was the Spanish communities, especially in places like Miami, but also in our area too, in the New Jersey tri-state area. There were pockets of Spanish-speaking Spiritist centers. Unfortunately, many of them have not lasted. But when the Brazilians came, there's been kind of an upsurge in the presence of Spiritism. And again, there are lots of ways many different immigrant groups provide different qualities. But if we just focus on Spiritism, right now it looks promising that the contribution that many Brazilians have made by coming here and doing a lot to introduce Spiritism to this country, even though this country has a long history with spiritualism, going back to the Fox sisters and all that in the 1840s. But there's a kind of a new surgence of energy that is happening through Spiritism, but in a lot of other ways too, because as I mentioned, people here are very spiritual in a variety of ways. And a lot of people are open to the idea of that the soul continues, for example. So in general, just to go back to the question a little bit more, in general, a lot of immigrants, groups that have come here, have had very profound and positive changes on this country, and that certainly would include its moral development. Just one example, Jews in this country, most of them are well educated. Many of them have been played important roles in a variety of innovations. And then other groups have done the same as well. Not able to hear, I'm afraid. Yeah. Okay.
And for the final question, and I think your comprehensive historical perspective has given a lot of the answer, but perhaps to give you a chance to wrap it up, how do we keep resilient and not get discouraged in the face of some current events happening on our planet?
I think the important thing is always that we have to have the long-term view. When we talk about Spiritism, one of the analogies of our spiritual progress is that analogy of you go to the top of a hill, a mountain, and you're able to see a lot further than if you're, say, down in the middle of a town or the forest or whatever. When we're caught up in the immediate stuff, all the political craziness that goes on, for instance, it's very easy to get discouraged. But the more we not only study history, but the more we think about the way humanity develops, we have to really connect to the long-term view. Spiritism is just one way to do this, but Spiritism encourages us to really embrace the idea that we're all a work in progress. And certainly I was trying to emphasize that this country is kind of founded on that idea that we, all of us collectively, are a work in progress. A work in progress means that no matter how difficult things are now, no matter how discouraging they are, all of it will pass. This too will pass. Eventually, we will start to straighten these things out. We have to. Can I guarantee that will happen? No. It won't happen if people insist on rebelling and insist on being stubborn, insist on being selfish, and insist on being prideful. And a lot of times the political turmoil that we have, which has a lot to do with inflexibility, which is rooted in immaturity, a lot of it can be rooted in pride and selfishness. I want what I want. It's my will, my way. And if the rest of you don't agree with me, then the heck with you. Now, that kind of attitude, of course, if it prevails and never, ever changes, then of course we're not going to make progress. But the question we could all ask ourselves, do we stay that way forever? In question 793, part of what it says is that a light kills darkness. That implies that light, goodness, is the natural state of things. Darkness is something we put on top of the light through our distortions, through our spiritual distortions, through our inability to see things clearly, through our stubbornness, and so forth. But if we insist on being stubborn, if we insist on being prideful, it takes a lot of energy to do that. It's exhausting. So it's probably safe to say that at some point, people will get tired of all the rancor and the pontificating and the judgment and the inflexibility and realize that maybe it's time to grow up.
And now I'll pass it back to Shane.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Peter. We'll go ahead and thank you, your time. Oops, I can hear myself 1 second. And not only you, but also the directors and mentors of your group, because they allow us to have this collaboration and donation of your time so that we can learn together. And we hope that in the near future, we can have you, maybe your wife, will do a, because she has done beautiful works. I looked at some of the books, the children's books online, and they look beautifully done. So maybe we can host you guys here in Richmond, and who knows, maybe we'll go to Monticello together, because it's really only less than an hour drive away from us. So thank you so much, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to be here. And may all of you have a blessed rest of the week.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, guys.